The cold encounter. The wind howled through the icy landscape, biting at Mark's face as he trudged through the snow. His boots crunched with each step, the only sound in the vast, frozen world around him. His breath came out in visible clouds, freezing in the air before disappearing into the storm. He pulled his jacket tighter, trying to keep warm, but nothing could stop the cold from seeping into his bones. It had been days since he'd last seen anyone. The mission had taken him far from the safety of the base, deep into the alien wilderness of this strange, uncharted planet. His team had been lost in the storm, scattered, and Mark had been left to find his way back alone. He didn't mind. He was used to surviving in harsh conditions. But this storm, it was different. It wasn't like anything he had ever experienced. The wind wasn't just cold. It felt alive, almost as if it was trying to push him back, to trap him here forever. Mark's eyes scanned the horizon, searching for any sign of shelter, any place to get out of the freezing wind. But the snowstorm was so thick, he could barely see more than a few feet ahead of him. The swirling white snow turned the world into a blur, and he had to rely on his instincts to navigate. Just as he was beginning to lose hope, something caught his eye. A flicker of movement, a shadow darting between the snowdrifts. Mark froze, his heart pounding in his chest. It was strange. There shouldn't be anything out here, especially not in this weather. He squinted, trying to make sense of what he had seen. Another flash of movement. This time, it was closer. Without thinking, Mark adjusted the straps of his gear and started moving toward the shadow. His mind raced with possibilities. Could it be a native creature of this planet, or maybe another lost explorer like him? But as he drew closer, the figure revealed itself more clearly. It was a girl. At first, Mark thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. A human girl out here, in the middle of this blizzard. It didn't make sense, but as he got closer, there was no mistaking it. She was real. Her skin shimmered faintly in the storm, as though it was glowing. The girl was crouched down in the snow, her arms wrapped around her knees, trying to shield herself from the cold. She looked terrified. Mark stopped a few feet away from her, not wanting to scare her. She didn't seem to notice him at first, too focused on the snow around her. Her eyes were wide with fear, and her breathing came in short, ragged gasps. She was clearly struggling to stay conscious in the freezing conditions. "Hey," Mark called softly, unsure if she would understand him. His voice sounded strange in the vast, empty landscape, as if the storm was swallowing it whole. "Are you all right?" The girl's head snapped up, her eyes locking onto his with a mixture of fear and confusion. She looked at him as if he was some kind of strange figure, someone she hadn't expected to see. For a moment, neither of them moved. Mark wasn't sure what to do. He had seen alien creatures before, but never anything like this. Her eyes weren't human, but they were full of emotion, fear, confusion, and something else. Something more. "Don't be afraid," Mark said softly, trying to calm her down. He took a cautious step forward, reaching out with one hand. "I'm not here to hurt you." The girl flinched at his movement, but something in his voice seemed to reach her. She didn't run, didn't scream. She just watched him, her gaze intense and filled with mystery. Mark could see now that her skin wasn't just glowing. It was shimmering, almost as if it was made of light itself. Her clothing was unlike anything he had ever seen before. Sleek, metallic, and yet strangely beautiful. For a moment, Mark hesitated. What was she doing out here? What kind of creature was she? And most importantly, why did she look so lost? Then he saw it. Her hands were trembling violently. Her body was shaking with cold, and her lips were pale. She couldn't survive much longer in this storm. Mark knew what he had to do. "I can help you," he said, taking another step closer. "Come with me. I have a shelter. It's not far." The girl didn't respond. She didn't say a word, but she seemed to understand. Her eyes searched his face, as if trying to figure out whether he could be trusted. Then, slowly, she nodded. Mark's heart raced, but he didn't wait for another moment. He moved quickly, making sure she stayed close behind him. His mind was filled with questions, but there was no time to ask them. The storm was getting worse, and the girl needed warmth. Fast. They walked together through the snow, the storm howling around them. Mark led the way, his eyes scanning the environment for any sign of danger. The girl kept a cautious distance behind him, but she didn't slow down. She was determined to survive. He could tell. After what felt like an eternity, they reached Mark's tent. It was small, just big enough for one person, but it would provide enough shelter from the storm. Mark quickly unzipped the entrance and motioned for the girl to go inside. She hesitated for a moment, but then stepped in, her feet barely leaving prints in the snow. Inside, the warmth hit them both like a wave. Mark quickly started a fire, the crackling flames offering a small sense of safety. The girl sat down, shivering uncontrollably, but she didn't speak. Mark didn't know what to say either. What could he possibly ask her? Why was she here? What was she? He shook his head, knowing that all those questions could wait. Right now, the only thing that mattered was that she was safe. For now. But deep inside, Mark felt a sense of unease. Something about this girl, this encounter, felt wrong. There was something he didn't understand, something that had yet to reveal itself. But for now, all he could do was wait and hope that the answers would come. The silent stranger. The fire crackled softly, casting flickering shadows across the walls of the small tent. Mark sat across from the girl, watching her closely. She had stopped shivering, but her eyes, those strange, glowing eyes, never left him. She was silent, lost in thought, as if the world outside the tent no longer existed for her. Mark couldn't help but study her. Her skin shimmered faintly, like starlight trapped in her veins, and her clothes, though made of some kind of metallic fabric, seemed fluid and soft, almost as if they were alive. Her features were delicate, but there was something otherworldly about her. She wasn't human. That much was obvious. But what exactly was she? Where had she come from? He opened his mouth to ask her something, anything, but the words felt strange on his tongue. What would he say? Who are you? Seemed too blunt, and where are you from? Felt like a question that would lead to more confusion than answers. The girl wasn't speaking, and for a moment, he wondered if she even could. Was she mute, or was she just too afraid to talk? Mark shifted uncomfortably, the silence between them thick and heavy. He looked away, trying to distract himself. The storm outside was still howling, but at least they were safe in here for now. He could hear the occasional gust of wind shake the tent, but the flames of the fire kept the worst of the cold at bay. The girl's gaze didn't waver. She was watching him intently, as though trying to figure him out just as much as he was trying to figure her out. Her lips were parted slightly, and Mark could swear that she was searching for the right words to say. The tension in the air was almost unbearable. "Are you okay?" Mark asked cautiously, not expecting an answer but feeling compelled to break the silence. The girl's eyes flickered, and for a moment he thought she might speak. But then she simply shook her head, her expression unreadable. It was as if she was lost in her own thoughts, her mind a million miles away. Mark frowned. What was going through her head? Why wasn't she speaking? He leaned forward, his curiosity getting the better of him. "You don't have to be afraid. I'm not going to hurt you. I just want to understand what's happening." For a long moment, there was no response. Then, slowly, the girl raised her hand and motioned toward the fire. Her fingers brushed the warmth, but she didn't touch it directly. The strange glowing light that pulsed under her skin seemed to glow brighter as she extended her hand toward the flames. Mark's heart skipped a beat. What was she doing? Was she trying to control the fire? Before he could ask, the girl retracted her hand, her face clouded with frustration. She looked down at her hands, staring at them as if they were alien to her. Mark couldn't help but notice how the firelight danced across her skin, highlighting the faint, almost invisible symbols that ran along her arms. They weren't tattoos. at least not in the way he understood them. They seemed to shift, changing shape like a language of some kind. Her hand clenched into a fist, and she pulled it back into her lap, eyes now fixed on the fire with an intensity that made Mark uneasy. "Are you okay?" Mark asked again, his voice softer now. "What happened to you?" The girl's gaze flicked to him once more, and for the first time, there was a hint of something like sorrow, in her eyes. She opened her mouth as if she was about to speak, but nothing came out. Her expression tightened, and she quickly closed her lips again. Mark watched her, waiting for her to say something, but she didn't. Instead, she stood up suddenly, moving so swiftly that Mark barely had time to react. She paced the small space of the tent, her movements sharp, almost frantic, as if she was struggling with something inside herself. Mark stood too, unsure of what to do. Should he try to calm her down? Was she in some kind of distress? But before he could make a move, the girl stopped and turned to face him, her eyes wide with what could only be described as fear. She pointed to her throat, then to her chest, her lips trembling. It was clear she was trying to communicate, but words weren't coming. Mark's heart sank as he realized the truth. She couldn't speak, at least, not in a way he could understand. Without a second thought, Mark moved toward her, his hand outstretched. He wasn't sure if she would allow him to get closer, but she didn't back away. Her eyes stayed locked onto his, and for the first time since their encounter, Mark saw a flicker of something different in them. Hope. "It's okay," he said gently, keeping his voice calm. "We'll figure this out. I won't hurt you." He reached into his pack and pulled out a small pad of paper and a pen, holding them out to her. The girl looked at the paper, then at him. She seemed confused at first, but Mark's gesture was clear. He wanted to communicate, to help her in any way he could. After a few moments of hesitation, she slowly reached out and took the pen from him, gripping it tightly in her strange, delicate fingers. Mark watched in silence as she stared at the paper for a long time. He had no idea what she was thinking, but something in the way she looked at it told him that she was considering her next move carefully. Then, without warning, she began to write. Mark held his breath as the alien symbols appeared on the paper, each one flowing smoothly from her pen, as if they were a language he couldn't possibly understand. It wasn't writing as he knew it, but it was something. It was the first step to communication. He waited, unsure of what to expect, but hoping that this would be the key to unlocking the mystery of who she was, where she had come from, and why she was here. When she finished, she handed the paper to Mark, her eyes anxious. As he took the paper from her, his hand shook slightly. What would it say? What was she trying to tell him? He looked down at the symbols, his mind racing. It would take time to understand. But one thing was clear, this encounter was far from ordinary, and Mark was only beginning to realize just how deep this mystery went. A strange bond. The fire crackled softly in the corner of the tent, its warmth filling the small space. Mark stared down at the paper in his hands, the strange alien symbols still swirling in his mind. He couldn't make sense of them yet, but something about the way the girl had written them made his pulse quicken. She wasn't just trying to communicate. She was trying to tell him something important. He looked up at her, sitting cross-legged by the fire, her eyes focused on the flames, but her mind clearly elsewhere. There was a quiet intensity about her, like she was constantly calculating, always thinking, always aware. Mark felt a growing sense of unease. She wasn't like anyone he'd ever met. The air between them felt charged, as if they were on the edge of something neither of them fully understood. After a long moment of silence, Mark spoke, his voice tentative. "I don't understand what you wrote, but I'm going to try. We'll figure this out, together." The girl's gaze flickered toward him. She didn't say anything, but there was a glimmer of recognition in her eyes, as if his words meant more to her than he could imagine. She nodded slowly, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. Mark wasn't sure why, but he felt as though she had just made a promise to him. Her eyes drifted back to the fire, the flickering flames reflecting in her glowing skin. She looked lost in thought, her expression far away. Mark couldn't help but wonder what was going on inside her mind. She had been through something terrible. That much was obvious. But what had brought her to this desolate planet in the first place? And what exactly was she running from? The girl shifted slightly, pulling her knees closer to her chest. Mark watched her, unsure of what to do. It was clear that she wasn't ready to share her story, that the silence between them was becoming unbearable. He had so many questions about who she was, where she came from, why she had shown up in the middle of a storm. Finally, unable to hold it in any longer, Mark spoke. "Where are you from?" The words came out before he could stop them, and he immediately regretted them. It was such a simple question, but one that might not have an answer. The girl didn't react right away. Instead, she stared at her hands, as if gathering her thoughts. Mark waited, hoping she would say something. Anything. But just as he was about to speak again, the girl slowly lifted her hand and placed it over her heart. She closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. When she opened them again, she looked at him, and for the first time, there was something softer in her gaze. Without warning, she reached out and placed her hand over his chest, just above his heart. Mark froze, not sure how to react. Her touch was warm, strangely warm, and for a brief moment, he felt a pulse of energy rush through him. It wasn't painful, but it was intense, like an electric current running through his veins. His heart raced in response, and he looked at her, confused and startled. "What was that?" he asked, his voice tight. The girl didn't answer. She didn't even move. Instead, her eyes seemed to focus more intently, as if searching for something inside him. Mark could feel the connection between them growing stronger, though he didn't understand it. Something was happening, something he couldn't explain. Suddenly, the girl pulled her hand away, her eyes wide with surprise. She seemed to be just as confused as Mark. Her body tensed, as if she was trying to process what had just happened. She glanced around the tent, then back at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. Mark's pulse continued to race, his breath coming faster as he tried to make sense of what was going on. "What was that?" he repeated, more urgently this time. The girl hesitated. Then, without warning, she reached for the pad of paper again, grabbing the pen with a quick, fluid motion. She scribbled something down quickly, her hand moving with practiced speed. Mark watched her, feeling a strange sense of anticipation building inside him. When she finished, she handed the paper to him with trembling hands. Mark looked down at the symbols, his heart pounding in his chest. It was a message just for him. He studied it for a long moment, trying to decipher the meaning. But this time, the symbols were different. They weren't just random markings, they seemed to form a pattern. A code, perhaps. Without thinking, he lifted his gaze to her. "What does it mean?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The girl didn't answer immediately. Instead, she closed her eyes and pressed her fingers to her temples, as if she was struggling to remember something important. Then, with a sigh, she slowly opened her eyes and nodded. Mark's stomach tightened. He had seen that look before, the look of someone who had lived through something unimaginable. He wasn't sure what the girl was hiding, but he knew one thing. She was a survivor. Whatever she had been through, she was stronger than she let on. And he was starting to realize that their fates might be tied together in ways neither of them could yet understand. For the first time, he felt a strange, almost magnetic pull toward her. It wasn't just a connection, it was something deeper, something far more intense than anything he'd experienced before. The moment their hands had touched, something had awakened inside him. He didn't know how, and he didn't know why, but he felt certain of one thing. Whatever was happening between them, it wasn't an accident. The girl finally spoke, her voice soft but clear. "I am not what you think I am." Her words were halting, but they held power. I was sent here. I don't know why, but I am not alone. and neither are you." Mark felt a chill run down his spine at the words. The storm outside seemed to grow louder, the winds whipping at the tent, as if answering her declaration. He opened his mouth to ask what she meant, but before he could speak, the fire flickered, casting an eerie shadow across the tent. The girl's eyes locked onto his, and for the first time, Mark saw a glimmer of something. Something that resembled fear, but it wasn't fear for herself. It was fear for him. And in that moment, Mark realized that their strange bond was only the beginning. The unexpected power. The tent was still, except for the soft crackle of the fire. Mark's mind raced as he tried to process what the girl had just said. "I am not what you think I am." The words echoed in his head, a warning he wasn't sure how to interpret. The strange bond between them was growing, but he couldn't make sense of it. He had never felt anything like this before, not from another human, and certainly not from an alien. As if to prove his confusion, the girl slowly stood, her movements fluid and graceful, like she was not fully constrained by the limitations of gravity. She stepped toward the fire, the glow casting strange, shifting shadows across her face. Mark watched her every move, unsure of whether he should intervene or just observe. There was something different about her now. Her earlier uncertainty had given way to a quiet determination, but it wasn't the same kind of strength Mark had seen in survivors before. This was something more, a kind of power that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. The girl stood there for a moment, her eyes closed, her breathing deep and rhythmic. Mark didn't dare speak. He had the strange feeling that she was preparing herself for something he couldn't understand. He took a cautious step back, suddenly aware that the air in the tent had shifted. It was heavier, thicker. A strange tension filled the space, and he felt it pressing down on him. The girl's eyes fluttered open, and for a brief moment, Mark saw something in her gaze. A depth, a mystery, something that told him she was no longer just a survivor in this storm. She was something else entirely. Then, without warning, she raised her hand toward the fire. Mark's eyes widened as he watched in disbelief. The flames seemed to respond to her gesture, twisting and bending toward her outstretched fingers. It was as if the fire itself was obeying her command, its very form shifting like liquid light. The fire grew brighter, its heat suddenly overwhelming. But it didn't burn. It was as though the girl was manipulating the energy itself. Mark took an instinctive step back, his heart racing. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice a mixture of awe and fear. The girl's expression was unreadable as she held her hand steady. The flames seemed to dance and pulse in response to her focus, growing and shrinking with every movement of her hand. For a brief moment, the fire surrounded her, encasing her in a bright cocoon of light. Mark could feel the warmth radiating from her, but it wasn't like the warmth of a normal fire. It was different, more intense, like it was drawing energy from the very air around them. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the fire snapped back to its normal, flickering state. The girl lowered her hand, her chest rising and falling with deep breaths. She stood still for a moment, her eyes closed as if gathering herself, before finally meeting Mark's gaze. Mark's mouth was dry. He had seen soldiers and scientists manipulate fire before, but never like that. Never with such ease, such precision. This was something beyond human understanding. What just happened?" Mark stammered, his mind struggling to keep up with what he had just witnessed. He had seen strange things before, alien technologies, deadly creatures. But this was different. This was real power. The girl's lips parted, as if she was about to speak, but no words came. Instead, her gaze flickered to the fire again, and she looked almost regretful. It was as if she didn't want to show him her abilities, as if revealing this part of herself was something she had been avoiding. Mark's curiosity got the best of him. "How do you do that?" he asked, stepping closer but keeping a cautious distance. Are you controlling the fire?" She didn't answer at first. Her gaze was distant, her thoughts clearly far away. Then, after a long silence, she spoke, her voice soft, almost hesitant. "It's not just fire," she said. I can feel it. The energy inside everything. The earth, the sky, the stars. It's all connected. And when I reach out, I can tap into it." Mark's brow furrowed. "Tap into it?" She nodded, her eyes never leaving the flames. "I don't fully understand it yet," she whispered, almost as if she was speaking more to herself than to Mark. "But when I focus, I can pull energy from the world around me. It gives me strength. But it's dangerous. I can't control it all the time." Mark swallowed hard, his mind racing. This wasn't just a survivor of a crashed spaceship or a lost traveler from another world. This girl was something more. Something with abilities beyond anything he could imagine. "Is that why you couldn't speak?" Mark asked, the pieces of the puzzle slowly starting to fit together. "Is it part of you? This power?" The girl's eyes flickered to him, and for a moment, she seemed almost apologetic. She nodded slowly. "I can't always control it. I didn't want to hurt you." Her voice wavered slightly. "I didn't want to scare you." Mark's heart softened at her words, but his fear remained. Whatever she was, whatever she could do, it was clear she wasn't fully in control of it. And that scared him. He was alone in this alien wilderness with someone who had the power to manipulate energy, someone who might not even understand the full extent of what she could do. But then again, Mark wasn't fully in control of his own situation either. He was stranded on a strange planet, caught in a storm that didn't seem to let up. And now he was bonded to this alien girl in ways he couldn't explain. "I'm not scared," Mark said quietly, his voice steady. "But we need to figure this out, together." The girl looked at him, a flicker of something. Relief, hope, passing through her expression. She nodded again, but this time, there was a spark in her eyes. It was a silent agreement, an unspoken promise. They were in this together, whether they understood it or not. And just like that, Mark knew that this strange, silent connection they shared had only just begun. Whatever dangers lay ahead, whatever challenges awaited them, they would face it together. But one thing was certain. Mark had never felt more uncertain of what the future held. The power she had just shown was only the beginning, and with it came a question he couldn't stop asking himself. What else could she do? And how much of it would she be able to control? The hidden truth. The air in the tent grew thick with tension, and the fire crackled low, casting an eerie glow on the girl's face. Mark sat on the edge of his makeshift cot, watching her closely. Her eyes were distant, but there was something in the way she held herself now, something he hadn't seen before. It wasn't just fear. It was something deeper, a kind of sorrow that seemed to radiate from her. Mark had been around soldiers long enough to recognize the signs of someone hiding a painful truth. It was in the way she kept her distance, in the way she spoke in fragments, in the way she hesitated before making any move. Whatever her powers were, they weren't a gift she wore proudly. They were a burden, something she had been running from. After the display with the fire, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that she was more than she let on. There was a history behind those glowing eyes, behind the strange symbols that adorned her skin, and he had to know what it was. He had to understand why she was here, why she had come to him. The girl sat across from him now, her legs drawn close to her chest, her gaze lowered to the ground. She was quieter than usual, lost in her own thoughts. The silence stretched between them like a thin thread, and Mark could feel it pulling him toward her, urging him to ask the questions that had been burning in his mind. Finally, he spoke, his voice tentative but steady. "What are you running from?" The girl's head snapped up, her eyes wide with sudden fear. She quickly looked away, biting her lip as if trying to keep the words from escaping. But Mark didn't let up. He could see her struggling with something, and he needed to know what it was. "You don't have to be afraid," Mark continued, his voice gentle, trying to reassure her. "Whatever it is, we can face it together." For a long moment, she didn't answer. Her eyes fluttered closed, as if she was trying to shut him out, but the tremor in her hands betrayed her calm exterior. She was holding something back, a truth she couldn't bring herself to say. Then, almost in a whisper, she spoke. "I wasn't sent here to find you," she said, her voice trembling with the weight of the confession. "I was sent here to find someone else, someone who could help me stop something." Mark's heart skipped a beat. "Stop something? What do you mean?" The girl's eyes darted to the fire, her face shadowed by the flickering light. She seemed to hesitate, like she wasn't sure how much she should say. "I'm part of a project," she finally admitted. "A weapon. Being created to stop a force that's coming. But something went wrong." Mark's mind spun. A weapon. The words felt heavy, out of place. This girl, this alien, was part of something that didn't sound like any kind of military experiment he had ever encountered. What kind of weapon? Her eyes flickered toward him, her expression darkening. Something that was never supposed to exist. I was supposed to be the key to stopping them. But I was a failure. They sent me away. They left me here. Mark could hear the pain in her voice, the raw emotion she was trying to bury beneath layers of cold determination. He didn't know who they were, who had created her, who had sent her on this mission. But one thing was clear. She was more than just an innocent traveler caught in a storm. She was a weapon, a tool in a larger, darker plan. "They left you," Mark repeated, his voice rising with the shock of the revelation. "Why? What happened?" The girl's face hardened, her hands curling into fists. "Because I didn't work. The energy, the power I can control, it's unstable. They thought they could use me to harness it, but they couldn't control it either. It's too much, and now it's too late." Mark leaned forward, his pulse quickening. Too late for what? For a moment, the girl didn't respond. She stared into the flames, her eyes distant again, her body tense with the weight of memories she wasn't ready to share. Mark could see the struggle on her face, the battle between the truth she was desperate to reveal, and the part of her that wanted to keep it hidden, even from him. "There's something coming," she said at last, her voice barely above a whisper. "A force that will destroy everything. The people who created me. They were trying to stop it, but they couldn't. Now it's spreading, and I can feel it. The power, the energy. It's like a shadow, creeping closer every day." Mark's heart hammered in his chest. A force? What kind of force? The girl's lips trembled, as if she was scared to say it out loud. "I don't know. But it's not from this planet. It's not even from this universe. It's ancient, beyond anything anyone can understand. And when it comes, everything will fall. The energy I have, what they tried to use, it's the only thing that can stop it. But I can't control it." Mark sat back, his mind reeling. A force beyond understanding. An ancient power coming from beyond the universe. And she was the key to stopping it. "Then we have to stop it," Mark said, determination building in his chest. "We'll figure out a way to control the power. You don't have to face this alone." The girl shook her head slowly, the weight of the burden pressing down on her shoulders. "I can't do it. I'm not ready. I wasn't meant for this. I don't know if I can stop it before it's too late." Mark's heart clenched as he watched her struggle. He knew the fear in her eyes wasn't just for herself. It was for the entire universe. She had been created to stop an unimaginable force, and now she was lost in her own uncertainty. "You don't have to do it alone," Mark repeated, his voice steady. "I'm not going anywhere." For a long moment, the girl just stared at him, as if trying to determine if his words were genuine. Then, slowly, she nodded, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and sadness. But as the fire flickered in the tent, Mark felt something deeper than just fear in the air. The girl wasn't the only one who was afraid. He felt it too, the pull of something far greater than them both, and he couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The choice. The storm outside had died down, but the silence inside the tent was suffocating. Mark sat with his back against the wall, his mind spinning from everything the girl had revealed. A force, an ancient, unimaginable power was coming, and she, this alien girl, was the only one who could stop it. But her abilities were unstable, and her past was filled with uncertainty. She was part of a weapon meant to combat this force, but now she wasn't sure if she could even control what had been forced upon her. Mark's gaze shifted to her. She was staring into the fire, her fingers twitching nervously at her sides. The glow from the flames reflected in her eyes, casting an eerie light on her face. She had been through so much, and yet she still held on to some shred of hope. A hope that maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to stop the oncoming destruction. But what if it was too late? Mark felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The weight of the situation was beginning to settle on him. There was no running from this, no ignoring the gravity of what they were facing. The girl had told him the truth, but it was clear she wasn't ready to confront it on her own. And now Mark had to decide whether he would walk away or join her in what could very well be a fight to save everything. Her voice broke through the silence, soft but steady. "You don't have to stay, you know. I won't force you to help me." Her words were guarded, like she was trying to give him an out, as if she were worried he might turn away when the truth became too much. She wasn't used to trusting others, especially not someone like him, a human who had stumbled into her life by accident. Mark looked at her, his gaze firm. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, the words coming out with a conviction he hadn't known he had. He wasn't sure why, but something inside him had shifted. He couldn't turn away now, not after everything she told him, not after everything they'd shared. She looked at him, her eyes searching his face as if looking for any sign that he was lying, that he might be in over his head. But he didn't flinch. The firelight danced in his eyes. And for a moment, Mark saw something else flicker in her gaze. Was it relief? Or was it just the weight of responsibility finally catching up to her? "I don't know if I can stop it," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm not sure I'm strong enough. And if I fail, everything will be lost." Mark felt his heart beat faster. She was scared, scared of failing, scared of the weight of the world resting on her fragile shoulders. But Mark had been through moments of doubt, moments when the odds were stacked against him. He knew what it was like to feel powerless, to feel like the burden was too much to bear. But those were the moments that defined people. Those were the moments when they either broke or found the strength to rise above it. "We don't know if you'll fail, but we'll never know if we don't try," Mark said, his voice filled with an unwavering determination. "You don't have to carry this alone. You never have to be alone in this fight." For a long moment, the girl didn't speak. She just stared at him, the weight of his words sinking into her. She was so young, too young for the responsibility that had been thrust upon her. Yet, somehow, she had survived. She had found him. And now, Mark realized, there was no turning back. Whatever came next, they would face it together. But then, a thought struck him, and his chest tightened with unease. What if we can't stop it?" he asked, his voice suddenly hesitant. "What if the force you're talking about is too powerful for us? What if we're not strong enough?" The girl turned her gaze back to the fire, her face etched with the kind of weariness that spoke of battles fought long before he had ever met her. Her shoulders slumped, as if the weight of his question had pushed her to the edge of despair. "I've asked myself that too many times," she said softly. "But I can't turn away now. Even if it's too late, I have to try." Mark understood. It wasn't about being strong enough. It was about doing what had to be done, even when the odds were stacked against them. Even when failure seemed inevitable, there was still the choice to fight. He knew that kind of resolve. He had seen it in soldiers, in survivors, people who refused to give up, no matter how bleak the situation seemed. "I'll stand by you," Mark said, his voice firm. "We'll face it together. Whatever happens, we're in this. You don't have to do it alone." The girl didn't answer right away, but Mark could see the tiniest spark of something in her eyes. Maybe hope, maybe just a flicker of belief. She was scared. She was uncertain. But for the first time, she wasn't alone. And maybe that was enough to keep her going. But Mark knew there was something bigger looming on the horizon. The force she had spoken of, the one that had been building for so long, was out there. And as they sat in the safety of the tent, it felt like the calm before the storm. He didn't know how much time they had, but he could feel the urgency growing, creeping into his bones like the cold that had taken hold of the planet. The decision had been made. There was no turning back. They would face whatever came, side by side. The girl stood up slowly, her movements fluid, almost graceful. Mark followed her gaze to the night sky, where the stars above seemed endless, a sea of light stretching far beyond their reach. "It's coming," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And when it does, we'll have to be ready." Mark nodded, feeling the weight of the moment settle over him. They didn't know what they were about to face, but they had each other. And together, they would fight whatever darkness was about to fall. The choice had been made. There was no turning back now. The unexpected ally. The night was quiet, save for the distant hum of the wind against the tent. Outside, the storm had finally passed, leaving behind a clear sky full of stars. But the calmness outside only heightened the tension inside Mark's mind. The girl, the mysterious being who had become both his ally and the key to saving, or perhaps dooming, the universe, stood beside him, her presence as unsettling as it was powerful. Mark watched her closely, his mind racing with the uncertainty of what lay ahead. She had explained that something catastrophic was coming, something older than any enemy humanity had faced, and yet he couldn't help but feel a growing bond between them, a bond that felt like it was destined to be more than just a shared mission. He had made the decision to stay, to fight beside her, but now he had to trust that they were strong enough to overcome whatever was coming. The girl shifted in the dim light, her glowing skin casting an ethereal hue across the tent. Her eyes, bright and intense, were fixed on something far beyond the confines of their small shelter. She was silent, lost in her thoughts, as if she could already feel the darkness that was approaching. Mark couldn't help but feel like time was running out, that every second spent sitting in this tent, waiting, was one more moment the force was getting closer. Finally, the girl spoke, her voice soft but filled with an eerie certainty. "It's not just the power I can control that makes me dangerous," she said, her gaze never leaving the stars. "It's what I can't control. The force that's coming. It has already started to change me." Mark's stomach twisted, the weight of her words sinking into him. "Change you?" he repeated, trying to understand. "What do you mean?" She turned to face him, her eyes haunted. "The energy inside me. It's unstable. When I use it, it grows stronger. And when it grows stronger, I lose control. It's part of the plan. They wanted me to be a weapon, but they didn't understand what would happen, what I can do, what I am. It's beyond what they intended." Mark felt a chill crawl up his spine. It wasn't just that she had powers. She was changing, becoming something more than human, something more than what anyone had expected. And if she couldn't control it, if that power continued to grow, there was no telling what she might become, or what would happen when they finally faced the force that was coming. "You don't have to do this alone," Mark said, stepping closer to her. "I'm with you. Whatever happens, I won't leave you." The girl looked at him, and for the first time, he saw something break in her, something vulnerable. She wasn't just an alien creature with unimaginable power. She was scared, just like anyone else would be. She was just trying to survive, to find a way to stop something she didn't fully understand. And she had no idea if she could. But she wasn't alone anymore. Mark reached out, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. The touch was light, but it sent a jolt through him. Something strange, like an electric shock that resonated deep within. She turned to look at him, her eyes wide. But this time, there was no fear. There was something else, something warmer, almost like a spark of hope. Then, the ground beneath them seemed to tremble. It wasn't a major shift, but it was enough to make the hair on the back of Mark's neck stand on end. The girl's expression darkened. She stepped back, her body tensing as if reacting to something invisible. "Did you feel that?" she asked, her voice tight. Mark nodded, his heart beginning to race. The unease that had been building in him now had a name. Something was coming. The ground wasn't shaking from a storm or the wind. It was as if something had just disturbed the very fabric of the planet itself. Before Mark could say anything, the girl closed her eyes, focusing intently. Her hands trembled, and Mark could see the glowing energy pulse beneath her skin. The fire inside the tent flickered violently, as if the air itself had changed. Then, without warning, she collapsed to her knees, gasping for breath. Mark rushed to her side, panic flooding his chest. "What's happening? Are you okay?" "I can feel it," she whispered, barely able to speak. "It's too much. It's too powerful. I can't hold it back much longer." Mark didn't know what to do. He wasn't a scientist or a soldier, trained to handle alien energy or forces beyond human comprehension. But he couldn't just stand there and watch her fall apart. He gripped her shoulders, trying to steady her. "You don't have to fight this alone," he said again, his voice firm. "We'll figure this out. I promise you." Her eyes fluttered open, and this time, there was something different in them. Something darker, but also clearer, like she had made a decision. "It's coming," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "and we have to be ready." "You're right, Mark. I can't do this alone." The tremors in the ground became more pronounced, and Mark felt a sudden rush of urgency. There was no more time to wonder what they should do. The force, whatever it was, had found them, and it was drawing closer. Just as he was about to ask her what their next move would be, the girl's entire body shuddered violently. Her hands glowed with an otherworldly light, her fingers twitching as if they were reaching for something beyond the limits of the tent. Mark had to step back as the energy began to pulse more strongly, the force of it sending a wave of heat through the air. "I can't stop it," she gasped, her voice pained. "But maybe we don't need to." Mark stared at her, unsure of what she meant. "What do you mean?" Her eyes locked onto his with an intensity that made his heart race. "You're not just here by accident," she said, her voice low. "You're the key to unlocking the last piece. Together, we can stop it, but you have to trust me." Mark didn't know how, but the weight of her words settled over him. Whatever this force was, whatever this ancient power had been building toward, it wasn't just her fight. It was theirs. And for the first time, he realized something important. He wasn't just an observer. He was part of this. As the ground trembled again, this time with greater force, Mark nodded. "I trust you." The girl's face softened for the briefest moment, and for the first time, she looked at him not as an ally or a weapon, but as someone who had become something far more important, a friend, a partner in this impossible battle. Together, they were ready. Whatever came next, they would face it, side by side.